Welcome to the Digital Agency Growth Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Englander. Charlotte, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Dan.
Yeah, and likewise, thank you for having me on yours back in the summer. It feels like so much time has passed since then, just with I don't know if it's the world or,
Yep.
it feels like it's a longer amount of time.
Well, I've created a new human since then. So yeah, it feels like a really long time ago to me.
Yeah, I can only imagine. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Welcome, kind of getting towards going back to work, it sounds like, and everything. So we were just talking before I threw on the recorder about the challenge of selling design and the challenge of being a small agency, and all of those things. So I guess my first question is like, what you're working with clients to help solve this problem, just like we are, of getting new business to be more consistent. What are some of those things that you're seeing most recently? Like, how do the problems look from when you first started working on this versus what you're seeing today, and what's typically going on when you're talking to a new agency?
Yeah. So things have actually changed quite a lot for me pre and post pandemic. And the reason for that, just to give a bit of background to the audience I generally work with, the majority of my clients are brand and packaging design agencies who work within the FMCG space. So when people were
would you mind defining that for those who don't know?
Yeah, fast moving consumer goods. So generally the stuff that you find in the supermarket. So what we found was that during the pandemic, when people were at home more and ordering in instead of spending money out, the budgets of my clients' grew massively. And that meant that they had a lot of money to spend on design following the pandemic. So actually, a lot of my clients have the challenge of there's a lot of inbound inquiries at the moment, and they don't know how to sift through them. But pre-pandemic, the challenge that the majority of them were facing is that the people I work with tend to be founder level, management level within smaller agencies up to 10 people. They really want to grow, but they don't know how, and they feel very much like they're in a creative role, don't like the sales process. And so it gets put to the bottom of the to-do list time and time again until they get to the point where they see warning signs in the cash flow and they know they need to address it. So a lot of people come to me in last minute panic where they desperately need work now. And the challenges that that most of the agencies face in this space is that this isn't a snap decision to hire a design agency. It's normally something that takes a long time to ponder over and decide on the brief for. So when they decide they need business straight away, they can't just go to a pipeline and say, hey, we're ready to start now. We'll cut the price and we'll do this with you, because their clients don't behave in that way. So we really need a long period of time to start building up a new business pipeline. And that's what I work with them on when we get over the initial last minute panic.
Yeah, you're hitting me where I live, because I think we're approaching the same problem from a different angle, and that I think all of us humans have that tendency to have sort of like recency bias, where we're like, well, the things are really good now, so they'll be good forever, even though we know cognitively, like rationally, that that's not true. I do think it's probably more pronounced in the design space or other spaces where there's just sort of this aversion to sales and new business. When I've worked in other verticals, like whatever, in technology or agencies that are more focused on other areas, there isn't so much of that same aversion. So this might be a tough question, but I guess, like, how do you encourage better behaviors in your clients and get people to think about, hey, it's not about your pipeline right now or even in the next 3 months, but it's about your pipeline and the behaviors you're doing now that are going to tee up things like 6-12 months or longer down the road?
Well, what I find is people aren't willing to entertain that conversation unless they see some initial action. So first of all, we work on fixing conversations that might lead to something immediately, and then start introducing behaviors that serve the company better in the long term, which aren't as sexy, like building a mailing list, which is very relevant, I feel, to agencies, even though a lot of people think it isn't, and it's more of a consumer facing business marketing method. I think it's really, really appropriate to agencies. And and also on developing the profile, raising the profile of their agency, which is some of the really painful, annoying stuff, like trying to get media coverage or trying to get speaker gigs at the places where their clients are hanging out. Until they're well known and respected in their space and people come to them with inquiries. And that can feel like a real uphill struggle. But when I explain the stories of, what the difference is between them and some of the agencies they admire, the bigger agencies in the space or the more profitable ones, often it's a case of visibility. And as soon as they understand that, they see the importance of putting the effort in for the long term rather than dealing with last minute panic. And, just to your point previously, I think this last minute panic thing is particularly endemic to this industry because that's the way a lot of creatives work. That's what they thrive on, is that sense of last minute panic. You could have a deadline, a quarter long, and the majority of the work will get done in the last 3 weeks or maybe even last few days, in my experience, even in big, well-organized agencies. I use well organized in inverted commas there because I'm not sure there's such a thing. But
well, it's funny because it almost reminds me of something I was reading that basically makes the argument that like all of us consultants and all the people giving advice would be better replaced by just therapists, giving people therapy. Like, why do you want that panic? Why do you subconsciously want this chaos in your life at all times? But anyway, to kind of get back to our day to day, how do you address that? Because I've seen that a lot too, where and it's less and less common, I think, as you work with bigger companies, but at least at the smaller entrepreneurial stage of the agency, you tend to hear a lot from clients. At least I do. Maybe you don't. And something to the effect of, we want everything to be fresh and new. We want to keep our team engaged. So we need to go after a new situation and a new type of client each time. And that goes hand in hand with all sorts of other stuff that creates this chaos. So I'd love to hear like your thoughts on that and how you kind of address that issue.
Yeah. That's a really important challenge. I think there's a fine balance between becoming stereotyped for a certain kind of project versus the scattergun approach where you're not truly niching down on anything in particular, and therefore people don't really know how to buy from you because they may not think you're a specialist in that space. Is this broadly what you're referring to?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So the way I approach that initially with clients, and what I find is I approach it in a quarterly basis. So I advise them to split the year down into 4 quarters and choose 4 industries that they want to target, one in each of those quarters, and start that way. And then if it feels like it's moving too slow, it's too little, then increase it. If it feels like it's too much and actually you could milk one industry a lot more, then maybe halve it and just focus on one industry every 6 months. And in terms of the industries that I advise them to go after, I follow a method that actually, when I was in agency, we once hired, it was a really long time ago now, over a decade ago, we hired an external new business consultancy who came in, and the first thing they did, which was a real shock to me, they didn't go through any of the marketing stuff. They went through, they sat down with the finance director and went through the last 5 years of billables to see what industries and what projects, what types of projects, what levels of decision maker were the most profitable and where we were losing money, and where we focused on those most profitable ones and then used those as the starting point for who we're going to be aiming on in the future. And that wasn't just industry, that was the level of decision maker that we're engaging in the conversation, that was the location that they were in, that was even the stage that decision maker was within their career within that company. As you're probably aware, most of the decision makers of my clients are marketing directors, CMOs who have been in the role maybe 3 to 6 months. The average marketeer has a lifespan within a company of between 18 to 36 months. And one of the things that they're always looking to change up is design, because it's something that's very tangible, very visible, and they can show that they've left a mark on a company when they leave, even if nothing else goes right. So that's how we decide on who we're focusing on in those quarters, is look at what's been most profitable, look at really where we're winning those previous clients from, the ones that have been working best for us, and then perhaps introducing a or two wildcards per year, but really at least for the first 2 quarters focusing on that bread and butter. So because, as I mentioned before, when people come to me, generally it's a case of last minute panic, and the easiest way to have conversations is with levels of people and within industries that you've got experience with before. You've worked with their competitors potentially, and therefore it's easier to convince people of your credentials and to work with you.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I agree. And I think that specialization, usually means a few similar industries or something like that. And I think tied to that, to kind of hone in on design. On one hand, design is really tangible, and it's something that people can wrap their heads around. It has an emotional element. I sold animated video in a previous life, and that was a really fun thing to sell. But on the other hand, especially like as the world has gotten more globalized, it's something that's become really commoditized, right? Where you have this perception of commoditization. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Like, how do you effectively sell design without becoming a commodity and actually being able to charge high prices? Maybe that's a big question.
Yeah, it's a big question, and we live in the age of Fiverr and everything else that's available. I myself use Canva, dare I say it,
Yeah.
because I can't turn to a graphic designer for everything, unfortunately. But I find the easiest way to do this, it actually doesn't change whether you're a huge agency or a small agency, but is prove the effectiveness of what you've done. So prove the ROI, because one thing that isn't frequently done within the world of design is relating the effect that something that's considered as subjective as design has had on the bottom line of a company. And if you can prove that it's really shifted revenue and profit for your previous clients, and you can demonstrate that with figures and qualify it, then really no one can argue with that data when you come forward and put forward a proposal for a project. If it's between 3 different agencies who are asked to put forward proposals, and one of them can demonstrate, quantify the effect that their designers had on a previous client, then no procurement team, no financial director can overlook that. And even if the marketer within the company, within the prospective client, wants to go with another agency, they're going to come up against some pretty hard clawback from the more kind of data focused people within their team, who will be like, well, look, this is a steady set of hands. Why do we not use the people who've proven that they've demonstrated the ROI previously within our industry? So it doesn't matter whether you're a big agency or a small agency. That's something that you can address. And it's not sexy. It's not, it's unbelievable how many big agencies I've worked with, where I've looked through their case studies and they said, why aren't people interested? I'm like, you've literally got no results here. You haven't even got a testimonial from your client. So who's to say this was actually a success for them? I think the most important thing when anybody's making a decision, whether you're a consumer or within business, is peer approval and proof that this is the solution for you. And if you've addressed that as an agency, then it's hard for people to argue with that, and it's rare. So so do it. And there's loads of tools on my site about quantifying the benefit that your design has had. Strongly recommend doing it. It's a pain in the ass, but it's so worth it once you've done it. I literally just got an email last night as I was going to bed from a client who just found out, they're a really small client, 2-person agency, and they outsource everything else. They've just found out that they've won a design effectiveness award, which is something that I've written for them and collated all the data with them from their clients to put forward. Design effectiveness award, I don't know if you're familiar with, but the DBA in the UK, which is like the national, the organizational body for design agencies, run these awards every year that are not based, they're not subjective about how pretty something is. They're all based on the data, all based on return on investment. and there's like 75 judges, and they're all C-suite marketers from within industry, client side. So, you know, they're up against some of the biggest agencies in the world, and they just can't believe they got there. But all it comes down to is like really being tenacious about getting that data, proving that your design has had an effect.
Well, I think bigger than that, like what I've seen and what I used to think, and a lot of, because I would hear this from clients we worked with, was, oh, we're going to sell this thing, whether it's design or media or something that's like relatively low cost to get in the door, and then we're going to grow and take over the whole company and, you know, become the agency of record and do all this other stuff within the account. And I'm not sure if I buy that anymore, because I think, and this is been articulated better by Robert Rose, who's come out with a lot of good stuff on this, which is that you kind of get into this like friend zone, right? Where if you walk into the door and you're like, we're the designers, then you're going to be pigeonholed as the designers or the social media people or whatever. So it's almost like you have to come in the door solving, you know, with enough trust to solve those big lucrative problems. So Robert Rose has put this well with this smile graph, where you have the value that goes, you know, up and then back down and then up again, where at the top left, the high value section, it's strategy, and it's sort of like, here are all the things that all the little tactics we can do fall into. And then back at the other end, it's measurement and CRO and that sort of thing. So I don't know. I guess I don't have a question. I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that, and see if, you know, if you have clients that are kind of slotting into that way of doing things.
Well, not that come to mind immediately, but one of the things that I find a lot of my clients really struggle with is to sell strategy. It's something that's often segmented down and outsourced to another agency, and they come in and do the executional stuff, and they really want to do the strategy. Otherwise, they're not going to get the brief that they want. So, you know, that's an area that they spend a lot of time working on, and it's something that they use more like softer marketing methods in order to kind of shape their client's perception of their ability within that area. So using thought leadership, or using press releases, or reaction to vox pops in reaction to something that's happened in the media, in order to draw the attention of their prospective clients and help them understand that they can address strategy as well. Because often times smaller agencies are kind of typecast as the kind of execution houses, and that's one of the limiting factors when it comes to growing as an agency. And it's not just about the number of people you employ, it's more importantly about profitability. And getting strategy as part of the project is a huge part of that profitability.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And to shift gears a little bit, we talked about, you know, your audience, and it sounds like there's a lot of people at an earlier stage, maybe like a few employees, and then a smaller segment that's like, you know, dozens of employees or up to hundreds. To start with the first group, and let's say, you know, I'm an owner or a partner. Maybe I have a few people doing fulfillment. I've got a few hours a week to do internal sales and marketing, whatever. Maybe it's 10 hours or something like that. I think both of us are approaching this issue, you know, from different tactics. Like, we focus on outreach and getting meetings. You're focusing on a variety of things related to inbound marketing. So to put the tactics on a shelf, to think more about the who, like who to hire when. If I'm that owner and I'm sort of like split between sales and client service, like what in your opinion is the order of operations? Like, what's the first hire I need to think about on that front?
It's a tough one, because if there's no client services director or somebody in that role, then you're never going to get away from your existing clients as that person who's overarching. If you are in a more digital capacity, as a lot of people are now, in a more remote capacity, maybe that takes the form of more of an online business manager kind of role, something hybrid there. It doesn't have to potentially be somebody full time. And perhaps even in some cases, if you're really well organized, then technology can take the place of that role to an extent, or perhaps limit the amount of time you need to employ somebody for. So I think it's really important that you understand those foundation stones of how your sales works before you hand that over to somebody else. And it oftentimes, understanding that and getting some standard operating procedures in place can allow you to outsource it to somebody who's much more junior later on, say, for example, even down to like a virtual assistant, and get them to do some of those actions until it comes to the more significant parts of the conversation where you need to get on a phone call with somebody and discuss their brief in more detail.
Yeah.
So I think there has, most people who are at the helm of a small creative business tend to be a creative themselves, and they naturally shy away from sales, as we mentioned pre-call. That's really common behavior, and because of that, they never want to be in the role where they're looking after new business. But I think that makes it all the more important. It's really important to understand what your needs are and what's working for your company, even slightly before you hand it over to somebody else. And furthermore, it can save you so much money in the long run, not just time.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. That's why, my opinion is that the first order of operations is getting the client work off your plate so you have time to sell. I think what we see a lot of the times is, the agency will hire a really experienced new business person, but there'll be no support for that person, right? So they'll just kind of be like walking off into the cold with a portfolio deck or something, and it
Yeah.
usually doesn't pan out.
No,
Yeah,
and they bring in the wrong kind of clients as well. I mean, one of the things that, so sorry, just to add on to that, that I think is really important to know is I've seen a lot of design agencies, specifically because that's my area of expertise, hire high flying new business executives from ad agencies and bring them into the agency thinking, yeah, this girl's going to sort it out, this guy's going to sort it out. They work for Ogilvy, they work for AMV, whoever else. But the reality is they don't understand design, and it's a very nuanced area. And I know not everybody listening to this is going to be working in the design space, but the chances are they feel that the same way about their space. Marketing, there are so many different portions to it, and everything is very, very very nuanced and has very different demands, and you can't just move as a new business person from one area to another and it be seamless. It just doesn't work like that. So I don't think you can just bring somebody in and just slot them in and let them go and do their thing.
yeah, and I think you also touched on another point, which is that now, like, the scarce resource so much is like resourcefulness, right? Especially with everyone being remote, where we've made some sales hires in the last year or so, and then some other hires, and I'm much more into the idea of hiring somebody that comes from a startup, even if that startup is completely outside of our space, than I would be hiring somebody that worked in the agency space, but in a ginormous agency. Because I just know that more likely this person's going to be able to learn more quickly. And it's not to say that that's better or that they're smarter or anything. It's just there's a different skill set, I think, that goes into working in a big institution and having that support versus having to come up with this stuff, on the fly.
Yeah.
That's been our experience anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I've done both. I've worked on both sides, and I think there's, to work in a startup, you need to be a self-starter. And I think that's the most important thing when you're coming in this kind of role into an agency. Having said that, when I first went into solo, like single agency, rather than working in a role where I was managing new business accounts across multiple different agencies. It was an entirely different story, but I was working for a kind of place where they managed multiple different agencies previously. But when I moved into a solo agency, I was that kind of one person who just came in and they were like, oh, just fix this. And I was left completely on my own, reporting into the CEO. And I mean, I nearly had a mental breakdown. I was like, I've been left with literally no handbook, no way of doing things, nothing, just been told to apply what I'd learned so far. I think I was like 25 at the time, and no, 26. And yeah, just let loose. And it took me ages to get my head around the fact that I had complete freedom. But once I did, and because I'm that kind of person and stubborn and determined to do things and won't take no for an answer, I like to think I know that I thrived in that role and contributed a lot towards that company, to the extent where they had to replace me with multiple people when I left. And that's the kind of person you need, like, not to blow my own trumpet, but somebody who's just doesn't expect an expense account, who doesn't expect to be told what to do, who is comfortable with feeling uncomfortable. And that's unlikely to be somebody who has worked in huge agencies and is used to all the bells and whistles and the frills, and the fancy meals. It's not going to work like that when you're in control of an entire agency's new business at a much smaller scale. So yeah, completely agree. Much more of a startup person, probably the right fit. And the other interesting aspect is when I previously worked, so I moved from agency to a tech startup, completely in a different space, but it come with recommendation. They ages chasing me, and I couldn't really quite understand why, but they basically brought me in because of the kind of I guess the kind of polished finish of doing new business within an agency. But being tech, it was very much move fast and break things, using technology to our advantage. As soon as you had a method of doing something, then find a way to automate that rather than doing it manually. And that blew my mind. I was like, there's so much opportunity for agencies who are doing so much stuff in such an old-fashioned manual way where it really doesn't need to be. I think there's been a lot of shift more recently because of working from home, etc. It was really interesting to see how my particular corner of that industry, which is very print focused, very CMYK, so it's rarely been done on screens, see how that adapted to working remotely and not being in one studio space. I think smaller agencies, which has been good for me, have become more comfortable with automating things, with doing things in a more lean manner. But I certainly feel like experience within the tech world is a massive advantage when you're going into a sales role, because you have that comfort with automation.
Yeah, and my impression, it's kind of evolving, is that the lines are blurring a lot. I think between tech and services and consulting and however you want to define it. I think that there was a time, and it's still there, where software as a service, just buying a software product was like the ultimate thing that you could have. But now it seems like it's not really about that anymore. It's more about having like a technology empowered service, or just solving the problem in the best way. It seems a little bit like just software alone is not on the same pedestal that it used to be. So yeah, that's kind of my thinking on it. What do you think though? Yeah.
I mean, it's software on its own is never going to be a solution in terms of building a pipeline for an agency. It's just not going to work like that. I think the conversations are too nuanced, and you need to be human. But I think there is an extent to which some of those actions can be automated, and I think it's important that they are.
Yeah, and I guess what I meant to add to that is, like, you look at, New York Times has started an agency, so publishers have an agency, agencies have proprietary software products have become publishers and have a podcast about the software product. So it just seems like a lot of these defined lines between, like, what does an agency even mean, is becoming a little more gray, not completely gray, but more. So it's interesting.
A lot of my old colleagues have, over the past few years, just to kind of relate that back to the world that I work in, which is, like I said, more kind of FMCG, so fast moving consumer goods, things that you buy in the supermarket, and design for those products. A lot of people within design and client services have moved client side, and so it does seem to me that a lot of clients are building their own in-house teams, which is really interesting. But at the same time, I feel like it's a bit like the spell we went through where people tried to do innovation internally and then realized it didn't work as soon as they brought it internally, and needed to work with an accelerator or some kind of external input to give a sense of immediacy to it. So I don't know. I mean, I know we're speaking loosely about new business, but I think overall, I think the way we create marketing materials, whether it's
it makes sense. I was just going to say, it seems like the specialization is becoming more. So I don't know if it's about in-house or out of house or that paradigm, but more just about what the tools that people are using and the way that you're delivering the solution. I'm not sure if it's about just technology or just people, but I think it's going to become more of a mesh, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. And a hybrid model is something that I use or encourage clients to do.
Yeah. And it seems like there's like a growing niche of companies that are just referring you to technology, right? Because there's so much to navigate. So That's we'll see, have to see where it goes. One question I wanted to ask you is, you've lived in 5 different countries. By the way, where have you lived?
Oh, good research.
Yeah.
I have lived in France, in South Korea, Cambodia, Italy. I'm missing one, aren't I? Well, and I guess the UK. I
Yeah.
think there's something else as well. I've forgotten.
And with that, so we're kind of like fish and water in the US. Like most of our outreach, and we're always doing outreach on behalf of agencies to get meetings with clients. Probably like 90+% are US and Canada to a lesser
Hmm.
extent. So I'd love to hear, like, what are the cultural differences? If you're an agency and you're reaching out to a London-based CMO, how should your messaging differ compared to the CMO in Texas, in Austin, Texas, let's say?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Well, a lot of my clients, even though they're not necessarily based in the UK, like I have a client in India, a couple in Germany, they are targeting marketers in the UK. So I tend to be focusing on UK based decision makers when I'm advising people. So I couldn't really tell you what the difference is between like Austin, Texas and London, UK. But what I find is that over the past few years, again, bringing it back to that data-driven approach, one finding is that a lot of marketers are looking for not just beautiful creative, but increasingly their decisions are being governed, or like marketing procurement has a hand in the decisions that they're making. And that means it's super important to show your return on investment credentials, even at the very early stage when you're having a very, very, very early introductory conversation. So I certainly think that's important in the UK. I can't speak for other countries. What else is important? I think getting in contact with people at the right time is always a massive challenge. I don't know to what extent, what factors govern in the US, but marketing planning period is really huge. Unfortunately, that tends to fall hand in hand with the UK school holidays.
Mhm.
So it's a very busy time for a lot of CMOs who also happen to be parents. So it can be quite challenging to get through to people at the right time, which is why I feel like that longer term approach of raising the profile of your agency is really important all year round, so that when you do get in contact with them, they're like, hang on, why do I know this name? Like, where have I heard this before? Oh, they spoke at X, or I keep getting an email from X organization and this person's featured on there as one of the speakers at the next conference, or things to that effect. Stuff's changed a lot because people haven't been meeting in person, but to me that's opened a lot of opportunities, because they're really, a marketer isn't paying as much attention to where someone has their offices, what huge events they might necessarily be speaking at. They're just seeing names or hearing names. So previously, if you didn't have your premises in the Soho area of London, then you might not be an agency of note. If you weren't speaking at Cannes Lions, you might not be an agency of note. But because these things don't seem to matter anymore, there's more of an opportunity for the players who are ambitious to be getting on people's radars without going through the previous means, which were often hard to get through.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So on one hand, it sounds like you're saying the credentials still matter, and kind of having those credentials matter, but the classic ones, and having these really expensive check marks, like being in a Soho. New York Soho is probably just as smart and bougie as London Soho.
Yeah.
Same idea. Don't matter as much anymore. So I guess can you talk about that a little bit? Like what credentials are accessible and do help you, and which ones are less important, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so the ROI, huge. Like I'm not going to stop banging on about that. That is the biggest thing. I think winning awards that are about ROI is really important. I don't have a lot of time for awards that are judged by peers on a purely subjective basis. But ones that are driven by data are hugely important, even for creative agencies, as I mentioned before. I think that being seen in the right publications is still important, but nowadays, I feel like that's taking more of the format of being in the right email newsletter or speaking on the right podcast, rather than being necessarily an in-person event, as I mentioned before, or being the sponsor of something at incredible expense. So things are a lot more reasonably priced, is what I'm saying, a lot more accessible if you're willing to do the legwork. I think the thing that I'm seeing most CMOs identify with is people in agency who aren't pretentious, who are able to talk comfortably and demonstrate true passion. I think a lot of the smoke and mirrors, like you say, about being in Soho and being, blinding people with their fancy offices, these things aren't washing as much anymore. And I'm seeing clients who are straight talking and honest and deliver incredible work. These are the ones who are succeeding most, which is wonderful to see because that's how it should be, right? It should be meritocracy. But unfortunately, because of the world we work in, like you used the word bougie, there's it's a very bougie industry, and previously, unfortunately, that would often turn heads faster than hard work.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it's sort of I think that's the most stark thing is like the spaces that we're all working are different, and you don't have to have that same BS. So that it sort of makes you ask like what other BS is there that we can strip away, and that begs all sorts of questions. So, yeah.
I mean, I always when I think about this, I always remember one client, very, very smart lady, global CMO, who didn't mince her words. She was both feared and respected for that. I remember walking into a new office of one of the agencies that I work with and looking around and saying, oh, this is why prices went up last year. And and that's what it comes down to. People can see through the fact, clients can see through the fact when you're spending a lot of money on something, whether that's advertising or sponsoring or fantastic officers or even like in mail, as opposed to a normal LinkedIn invitation. These are all things that are paid for and therefore aren't meritocratic, and also that money has to come from somewhere, and that means that money isn't being spent on time on the project. It's come from somebody's billables. So yeah, I think it's really important to demonstrate that you're doing things under your own steam now more than ever.
Yeah, it's a fine line. So I think the signaling is going to keep happening, but just probably it's going to change. The venues where it's happening are going to change. So it's going to be weird to see how it evolves and everything. Charlotte, this has been great. I guess to kind of like close out our time, can you talk a little bit about like what's your focus as you get back into work and everything? Any big projects you're working on coming up?
Yeah, well, we've got a wait list of people who've been wanting to work one-on-one, which is exciting. So yeah, I've got to get stuck back into that, but really just trying to keep on top of the admin and reach out to as many smaller agencies as possible who are looking to grow, because a lot of them are have struggled over the past couple of years getting their names out there, keeping the lights on when issues like in the UK, the furlough scheme were cut. It's really seriously affected a lot of, I don't know if you had something similar in the US, and I know we're extremely fortunate to have had it in place, but it's really adversely affected a lot of smaller agencies. So although it's my bread and butter, getting back to working with people who truly need to grow their businesses is something that I'm excited about, because the world needs more people with creative solutions, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. And with that, I know that you have like a lot of resources. You mentioned some at the beginning. Where can people go to see what you're doing and get access to those things and so on?
Absolutely. So the best place to go is to caffeine.club. That's KAFFEEN.club, and click on the free new business training, and that'll take you through to a video which is gives you a really I guess it's like our signature offering in terms of how we approach new business for smaller agencies looking to scale. very affordable, accessible way of challenging this, taking on this challenging area. And also, as you mentioned before, for anybody who's looking to grow and hire a salesperson, this gives you a kind of blueprint that you might want to consider before hiring somebody, so you know exactly what you're going to be asking them to do. So yeah, that's where I'd recommend going if you know that new business is something you need to tackle.
Yeah, it's definitely something to think a lot about and get a lot of perspectives on. And yeah, and I checked it out before the interview. And thank you for practicing what you preach and having really good design on it too, because that's
thank you.
Yeah.
All kudos to the wonderful Sophie Garwell, a very good friend as well as a very good designer. So thank you for that.
Yeah,
on her behalf.
For sure. Definitely recommend the resources. And Charlotte, thank you so much again, and hope to have you back on before long.
Thank you. Thanks, Sam. Bye.